Imagine a typical school day turning into a moment that changes everything. A young girl, just trying to get through her classes, is suddenly sent home in tears, not because of a bad grade or a playground argument, but because of something so shocking it leaves everyone questioning what just happened. This is the story of a teacher who thought she was doing the right thing, only to realize she had made a mistake that would come back to haunt her in ways she never expected. And it all started with a pair of pants. Meet 10-year-old Mia, a bright and spirited fifth grader who loves art class and dreams of becoming a scientist. She's a kind of kid who always has a smile on her face and a kind word for her classmates. But one day, her world is turned upside down when her teacher, Mrs. Thompson, pulls her aside during recess. Mia's outfit, a cute top and leggings, had been deemed inappropriate by the teacher, who insisted she couldn't stay in school without proper pants. Confused and embarrassed, Mia is sent home early, her confidence shattered. But what Mrs. Thompson didn't know was that this decision would set off a chain of events she couldn't have predicted. At home, Mia's dad, Marcus, is shocked to see his daughter walking through the door in the middle of the day. Marcus isn't just any dad, he's a well-known civil rights attorney who has spent his career fighting for fairness and equality. When he hears what happened, his protective instincts kick in. But this isn't just about a pair of pants. It's about respect, dignity, and the way people in authority treat those who depend on them. Marcus knows this isn't just a simple misunderstanding. It's a moment that demands accountability. As the story unfolds, tensions rise. Mrs. Thompson, a veteran teacher with years of experience, stands by her decision, convinced she was enforcing the school's dress code. But as word spreads through the community, parents and students alike begin to question whether the rules were applied fairly. Was Mia really out of line, or was there something deeper at play? The school administration finds itself caught in the middle, trying to balance the need for discipline with the growing outcry from parents who feel their children are being unfairly targeted. And then, the bombshell drops. When Mrs. Thompson learns who Mia's father is, her confidence wavers. Marcus isn't just any parent. He's someone who knows how to navigate the system and isn't afraid to use his voice to demand justice. The teacher begins to wonder if she's made a mistake that could cost her more than just her reputation. But it's too late to turn back now. The wheels are already in motion, and what happens next will leave everyone, students, parents, and teachers, rethinking the way they treat one another. What will Marcus do next? How will the school respond? And will Mrs. Thompson ever be able to make things right? The answers to these questions will change everything. But for now, the tension is building, and the stakes have never been higher. Stay tuned to find out what happens in this unforgettable story of fairness, family, and the power of standing up for what's right. Continue from where the introduction left off, and write the next 500 words for my story. This part should provide background and context, helping to deepen the plot and characters. Keep building suspense, but don't resolve any of the tension created in the previous section. Expand on the mystery or conflict, and keep the narrative engaging with additional relevant keywords. Also, do not make any headings. Only write story in paragraphs. Also, keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also, make the script human-centric, and don't give feel of AI-generated. Also, don't create violated content which can affect YouTube policy. As Marcus sat with Mia at their kitchen table, he could see the hurt in her eyes. She fiddled with the hem of her top, her voice barely above a whisper as she explained what had happened. She said my leggings weren't pants, Dad, Mia said, her lip trembling. She said I couldn't stay in school like that. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. He knew this wasn't just about clothing. It was about how his daughter had been made to feel. Mia was a kid who loved school, who always followed the rules, and now she was questioning whether she even belonged there. Marcus couldn't let this slide. But before he could act, he needed to understand the full story. He called the school, asking for a meeting with the principal and Mrs. Thompson. The principal, Mr. Harris, agreed to meet the next day, but Marcus could sense hesitation in his voice. It was clear this wasn't the first time a parent had raised concerns about Mrs. Thompson's strict enforcement of the dress code. In fact, over the past year, several parents had quietly complained about her handling of similar situations, but nothing had ever come of it. Mrs. Thompson had been at the school for over a decade, and her reputation as a no-nonsense teacher had always been seen as a strength until now. Meanwhile, Mia's classmates were buzzing with gossip. Kids whispered in the hallways, wondering why Mia had been sent home. Some of them had seen her crying as she left, and the story spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, even parents were talking. Texts flew between group chats, with some defending Mrs. Thompson and others questioning whether the dress code was being applied fairly. One parent, whose daughter had also been called out for her outfit earlier in the year, reached out to Marcus. "It's not just Mia," she said. "There's a pattern here and it's not right." As Marcus dug deeper, he began to uncover more about Mrs. Thompson's history. She was known for being tough, but some parents felt her strictness crossed the line. One mother shared how her son had been sent to the office for wearing a hoodie on a cold day, even though other kids were allowed to keep theirs on. Another parent recalled how her daughter had been told her bra straps were distracting and had to change into a gym shirt. These stories painted a picture of a teacher who seemed to focus more on enforcing rules than understanding the kids she was teaching. But why? What was driving her to be so rigid? The next day, Marcus arrived at the school with Mia by his side. He wanted her to see that he had her back, no matter what. The meeting with Mr. Harris and Mrs. Thompson was tense from the start. Mrs. Thompson stood by her decision, insisting that the dress code was clear and that she was just doing her job. "We have to maintain standards," she said firmly. But Marcus wasn't buying it. "Standards shouldn't come at the cost of a child's dignity," he replied, his voice steady but firm. He pointed out that Mia's outfit was no different from what other kids were wearing, and yet she was the one singled out. "Why her?" he asked. "What made her different?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her confidence wavering for the first time. She glanced at Mr. Harris, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was clear they hadn't expected Marcus to come in so prepared. But Marcus wasn't done. He brought up the other parents' concerns, the stories of kids who had been humiliated or sent home over minor dress code violations. "This isn't about clothes," he said. "This is about fairness. And if this is how you treat kids, then we have a much bigger problem." The room fell silent. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, promising to look into the matter further. But Marcus knew this wasn't over. He could see the doubt creeping into Mrs. Thompson's eyes, the realization that she might have gone too far. But what would she do next? Would she apologize or double down? And how far was Marcus willing to go to make sure this never happened to Mia, or any other child again? As they left the school, Mia looked up at her dad. "Are they going to fix it?" she asked. Marcus squeezed her hand. "We're not done yet," he said. "But I promise you we're going to make this right." The battle was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. What would happen next? Would the school take action? Or would Marcus have to take matters into his own hands? One thing was certain. This story was far from finished. The days following the meeting at the school were anything but quiet. Word of what had happened to Mia spread through the community like wildfire. Parents who had previously stayed silent began speaking up, sharing their own stories of how their children had been treated by Mrs. Thompson. A group of moms even started a petition, calling for a review of the school's dress code policy and how it was being enforced. The local news caught wind of the story, and soon reporters were calling the school for comments. What had started as a single incident was now turning into a full-blown controversy. Marcus, meanwhile, was determined to keep the focus on fairness. He knew this wasn't just about Mia anymore. It was about every child who had ever felt singled out or humiliated by unfair rules. He reached out to other parents, organizing a meeting at the community center to discuss their concerns. The turnout was bigger than he expected. Dozens of parents showed up, some with their kids in tow, all eager to share their experiences. One father talked about how his son had been sent home for wearing a shirt with a small logo on it, while another mother tearfully described how her daughter had been told her natural hair was too distracting during class. The stories were heartbreaking, and they all pointed to the same troubling pattern. As the community rallied together, the school board found itself under increasing pressure to act. Mr. Harris, the principal, called an emergency meeting with the board members to address the growing outcry. Mrs. Thompson was asked to attend, and for the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. She had always believed she was doing what was best for the students, but now she was being painted as the villain. "I was just following the rules," she insisted during the meeting. But the board members weren't convinced. "Rules should be fair and applied equally," one of them said. "If parents and students feel targeted, then we need to take a hard look at how those rules are being enforced." While the adults debated, Mia and her classmates were dealing with their own struggles. At school, the atmosphere was tense. Some kids sided with Mia, saying the dress code was unfair, while others defended Mrs. Thompson, arguing that rules were rules. Mia found herself caught in the middle, trying to navigate the whispers and sideways glances. She just wanted things to go back to normal, but deep down she knew they couldn't, not until something changed. Her best friend, Jasmine, tried to cheer her up. "You're like a hero," she said. "Everyone's talking about how brave you are." But Mia didn't feel brave. She just felt tired. Meanwhile, Marcus was working behind the scenes to keep the momentum going. He reached out to a local advocacy group that focused on education equity, and they offered their support. Together, they drafted a proposal for the school board, suggesting changes to the dress code policy that would make it more inclusive and less open to interpretation. They also called for mandatory training for teachers on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity. Marcus knew it wouldn't be easy to get the board to agree, but he was ready to fight for it. "This isn't just about my daughter," he told the group. "This is about making sure every kid feels respected and valued." As the school board meeting approached, tensions continued to rise. Parents on both sides of the issue were making their voices heard, and the local news was covering the story daily. Mrs. Thompson, once confident in her decisions, was now second-guessing everything. She had always believed she was doing the right thing, but the backlash was overwhelming. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying the moment she sent Mia home. Had she really been fair? Or had she let her own biases cloud her judgment? The night before the school board meeting, Marcus sat down with Mia to talk. "No matter what happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. You stood up for yourself, and because of that, other kids might not have to go through what you did." Mia nodded, but she still looked worried. "What if they don't change anything?" she asked. Marcus smiled gently. "Then we'll keep fighting," he said. "But I have a feeling this is just the beginning." The stage was set for a showdown. The school board meeting would decide the fate of the dress code policy, and possibly Mrs. Thompson's career. But with so much at stake, would the board do the right thing? Or would they side with tradition over fairness? The community was watching, and the pressure was mounting. One thing was clear. This story was far from over, and the next chapter would change everything. The morning of the school board meeting dawned with an air of anticipation that could be felt across the entire town. Parents, students, and even teachers gathered outside the school auditorium, where the meeting was set to take place. Signs reading "Fair dress codes for all" and "Respect our kids" bobbed above the crowd, while reporters jostled for the best angles to capture the moment. Inside, the board members sat at a long table, their faces serious as they prepared to address the issue that had divided the community. Marcus stood near the front, his arm around Mia's shoulders, while Mrs. Thompson sat quietly in the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tension in the room was palpable. One by one, parents stepped up to the microphone to share their thoughts. A mother of a 7th grader broke down as she described how her daughter had been sent home for wearing a skirt that was too short, even though it met the school's length requirements. A father spoke about how his son had been humiliated in front of his classmates for wearing a shirt with a peace sign on it, which the teacher deemed inappropriate. Each story added fuel to the fire, and the room buzzed with murmurs of agreement and frustration. Marcus waited patiently for his turn, his notes in hand. When he finally stepped up to speak, the room fell silent. "This isn't just about a pair of pants," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about how we treat our children. It's about respect, dignity, and fairness. My daughter, Mia, was sent home because her teacher decided her outfit wasn't good enough. But what message does that send to her? That her worth is determined by what she wears, that she doesn't belong." He paused, looking around the room. "This isn't just about Mia. It's about every child who's ever been made to feel less than because of a rule that wasn't applied fairly. We have a chance to do better, to be better. And I hope tonight we take that chance." The room erupted into applause, but not everyone was convinced. A few parents argued that the dress code was necessary to maintain order and discipline. "If we start bending the rules, where does it end?" one man asked. "Kids need structure." But his words were met with boos and shouts from the crowd. The divide in the room was clear, and the board members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew whatever decision they made would leave someone unhappy. As the meeting continued, Mrs. Thompson was called to speak. She walked to the microphone slowly, her usual confidence replaced by visible unease. "I've been a teacher for over 15 years, she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've always believed that rules are there for a reason. But lately I've been asking myself if I've been too strict. If maybe I've lost sight of what's really important, the kids. She glanced at Mia, who was sitting with her dad, and for a moment, her composure cracked. I never meant to hurt anyone. I just wanted to do my job. But if I've made mistakes, I'm willing to learn from them. Her words hung in the air, leaving the room in stunned silence. No one had expected her to show vulnerability, and even Marcus felt a flicker of sympathy. But the question remained, was it enough? Would the board see her admission as a step toward change, or would they view it as too little, too late? The board members huddled together, their voices low as they debated what to do. The crowd waited anxiously, the tension so thick it felt like the room might burst. Finally, the board president stood up and addressed the room. "We've heard a lot tonight," she said, "and we understand how important this issue is to all of you. We need some time to review everything and make a decision that's fair to everyone involved. We'll announce our decision at a special meeting next week." The announcement was met with a mix of relief and frustration. Some parents were glad the board was taking the time to consider everything, while others felt the delay was just another way to avoid making a tough call. Marcus, however, knew this wasn't the end. He could feel the momentum building, and he wasn't about to let it go to waste. "We'll be here next week," he said to the board members as the meeting adjourned. "And we'll keep fighting until every child in this school is treated with the respect they deserve." As the crowd began to disperse, Mia tugged on her dad's sleeve. "Do you think they'll really change anything?" she asked. Marcus looked down at her, his expression determined. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said. "But I do know this. We're not going to stop until they do." The battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. What would the board decide? Would Mrs. Thompson's apology be enough to save her job? And how far was Marcus willing to go to make sure justice was served? The answers were just out of reach, and the tension was building to a breaking point. The next chapter of this story would change everything, but for now all anyone could do was wait. As the days passed leading up to the special school board meeting, the tension in the community only grew. Marcus spent every spare moment preparing, gathering more stories from parents and students who had felt targeted by the dress code. He even reached out to a former student of Mrs. Thompson's, a young woman named Tasha who was now in college. Tasha had her own story to tell, one that would change everything. When Marcus met Tasha at a coffee shop, she hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted to revisit the past. But after a few minutes, she opened up. "I was in Mrs. Thompson's class 5 years ago," Tasha said, her voice low. "One day, she sent me to the office because she said my braids were too distracting. I was so embarrassed, I begged my mom to let me straighten my hair after that. It took me years to feel confident wearing my natural hair again." Marcus listened, his heart sinking. This wasn't just about clothes. It was about identity, culture, and self-expression. Tasha's story was the missing piece he needed, and he knew it could turn the tide in their favor. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson was grappling with her own turmoil. The backlash had taken a toll on her, and she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about teaching. She reached out to a mentor, a retired teacher named Mr. Grayson, who had always been a voice of reason in her life. Over tea at his cozy home, she confessed her doubts. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice breaking. "But now I wonder if I've been too hard on them. If I've been unfair." Mr. Grayson listened patiently, then leaned forward. "Teaching isn't just about rules," he said. "It's about understanding. If you've lost sight of that, it's not too late to find it again." The night before the special meeting, Marcus sat down with Mia to talk. "I found someone who's going to help us," he said, explaining Tasha's story. Mia's eyes widened. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "It's not just about you anymore, Mia. It's about all the kids who've been made to feel like they don't belong. This is bigger than any one person." Mia smiled faintly, but there was still worry in her eyes. "What if they don't listen?" she asked. Marcus squeezed her hand. "Then we'll keep fighting," he said. "But I have a feeling this is going to change everything." The day of the meeting arrived, and the auditorium was packed. Parents, students, and even some teachers filled the seats, while reporters lined the walls, cameras ready. The board members took their places, their expressions unreadable. Marcus sat near the front with Mia and Tasha, while Mrs. Thompson sat in the back, her hands trembling in her lap. The air was thick with anticipation, and everyone knew this meeting would be different. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone with Tasha by his side. "We've heard a lot about rules and standards," he began, his voice strong. "But what we haven't talked about enough is the impact those rules have on our kids. This is Tasha. She was a student here 5 years ago, and she has something to say." Tasha took a deep breath, then began to share her story. As she spoke, the room fell silent. Parents who had been on the fence listened intently, their expressions shifting from skepticism to concern. Even the board members seemed moved, their stern faces softening as Tasha described how Mrs. Thompson's comments about her hair had affected her confidence for years. When Tasha finished, the room erupted into applause. Marcus stepped back up to the microphone. "This isn't just about Mia, or Tasha, or any one student," he said. "This is about every child who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. We have a chance to do better, to create a school where every kid feels respected and valued. I hope tonight you'll take that chance." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly feeling the weight of the moment. But just as the board president was about to respond, a voice rang out from the back of the room. It was Mrs. Thompson. "May I say something?" she asked, her voice trembling. The room fell silent as she walked to the microphone. "I've made mistakes," she began, her eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I was wrong. I hurt students like Mia and Tasha, and for that, I am truly sorry. I want to do better, to be better. And I hope you'll give me the chance to make things right." Her words hung in the air, leaving the room in stunned silence. No one had expected her to apologize so openly, and even Marcus felt a flicker of hope. But the question remained. Was it enough? Would the board see her admission as a step toward change, or would they view it as too little, too late? The tension in the room was unbearable, and everyone held their breath as the board president stood up to speak. "We've heard a lot tonight," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And we understand how important this issue is to all of you. We need some time to review everything and make a decision that's fair to everyone involved. We'll announce our decision at a special meeting next week." The announcement was met with a mix of relief and frustration. Some parents were glad the board was taking the time to consider everything, while others felt the delay was just another way to avoid making a tough call. Marcus, however, knew this wasn't the end. He could feel the momentum building, and he wasn't about to let it go to waste. "We'll be here next week," he said to the board members as the meeting adjourned. "And we'll keep fighting until every child in this school is treated with the respect they deserve." As the crowd began to disperse, Mia tugged on her dad's sleeve. "Do you think they'll really change anything?" she asked. Marcus looked down at her, his expression determined. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said. "But I do know this. We're not going to stop until they do." The battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. What would the board decide? Would Mrs. Thompson's apology be enough to save her job? And how far was Marcus willing to go to make sure justice was served? The answers were just out of reach, and the tension was building to a breaking point. The next chapter of the story would change everything, but for now all anyone could do was wait. The night of the final school board meeting arrived, and the auditorium was more packed than ever. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, their faces tense with anticipation. Marcus sat near the front with Mia and Tasha, while Mrs. Thompson sat in the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The air was electric, and everyone knew this was the moment of truth. The board members took their places, their expressions serious as they prepared to announce their decision. The room fell silent as the board president stood up to speak. "After careful consideration," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "we've decided to revise the school's dress code policy to ensure it is fair, inclusive, and respectful of all students. Moving forward, the policy will focus on safety and practicality, rather than subjective judgments about what is appropriate. Additionally, we will be implementing mandatory training for all staff on cultural sensitivity and implicit bias." The room erupted into applause, but she wasn't done. "We've also decided that Mrs. Thompson will remain at the school, but she will be required to complete additional training and will be closely monitored to ensure she adheres to the new guidelines." The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some parents cheered, relieved that change was finally happening, while others grumbled, unhappy that Mrs. Thompson wasn't facing harsher consequences. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't everything he had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. He turned to Mia, who was smiling for the first time in weeks. "We did it," he said, squeezing her hand. "This is just the beginning." But just as the meeting was about to adjourn, a voice rang out from the back of the room. It was Mrs. Thompson. "May I say something?" she asked, her voice trembling. The room fell silent as she walked to the microphone. "I want to thank the board for giving me a second chance," she began, her eyes filled with tears. "But I also want to say something to Mia and Tasha and to all the students I've hurt over the years. I was wrong. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I failed to see the impact my actions had on you. I am truly sorry, and I promise to do better." Her words hung in the air, leaving the room in stunned silence. No one had expected such a heartfelt apology, and even Marcus felt a flicker of hope. But then Mrs. Thompson dropped a bombshell. "Because of that," she continued, "I've decided to step down from my position as a teacher. I need time to reflect and learn, and I don't want my presence to be a distraction for the students. This school deserves a fresh start, and so do I." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Marcus looked at Mia, who seemed just as shocked as everyone else. Mrs. Thompson's decision was unexpected, but it was also a powerful gesture of accountability. As she walked away from the microphone, the room burst into applause, not just for her, but for the hope that this moment represented. Change was possible, and it started with taking responsibility. As the meeting adjourned, Marcus and Mia made their way to the parking lot. "Do you think she really meant it?" Mia asked, her voice quiet. Marcus nodded. "I think she did," he said. "Sometimes, people make mistakes. What matters is what they do after." Mia smiled, a sense of closure finally settling over her. "I'm glad it's over," she said. "But I'm also glad it happened. It made me stronger." Marcus pulled her into a hug, feeling a mix of pride and relief. The battle had been long and exhausting, but it had been worth it. As they drove home, Marcus couldn't help but think about what came next. The new dress code policy was a victory, but there was still work to be done, not just at the school, but in the community and beyond. Change didn't happen overnight, but it started with moments like this, with people standing up for what was right. And then, as they pulled into their driveway, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a text from Tasha. "Thank you for everything," it read. "You and Mia inspired me to start a mentorship program for girls who felt like they didn't belong. I want to help them find their voice, just like you helped me find mine." Marcus smiled, feeling a surge of hope. The fight wasn't over, but it was clear that their actions had already started a ripple effect. And as he looked at Mia, he knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The story wasn't ending, it was evolving. And the best part was yet to come. In the weeks that followed the school board meeting, the community began to heal. The new dress code policy was implemented quickly, and parents and students alike noticed a difference almost immediately. The focus shifted from arbitrary rules to creating an environment where every child felt comfortable and respected. Teachers attended workshops on cultural sensitivity and implicit bias, and the school even hosted a series of assemblies where students could share their experiences and ideas for making the school a better place. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Mia returned to school with her head held high, feeling a newfound sense of confidence. Her classmates, inspired by her bravery, started a student-led initiative called Dress for Success, which encouraged kids to express themselves through their clothing while still following the new guidelines. Mia became one of the leaders of the group, and for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. Jasmine, her best friend, was by her side every step of the way, and together they worked to make sure no one else felt the way Mia had. "You started something really big," Jasmine told her one day during lunch. "Everyone's talking about how cool it is to be themselves now." Mia smiled, feeling a sense of pride she hadn't known before. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to advocate for fairness and equality, not just at the school but in the wider community. He partnered with Tasha to launch her mentorship program, which quickly gained traction. Local businesses and organizations offered their support, and soon, the program had a waiting list of girls eager to join. Tasha became a role model for many, sharing her story and encouraging others to embrace their identities. "It's not about fitting in," she told the girls during one of their first meetings. "It's about standing out and being proud of who you are." As for Mrs. Thompson, her decision to step down had a profound impact on her. She took time off to reflect and enrolled in courses on diversity and inclusion. She even reached out to Marcus and Mia, asking if she could meet with them to apologize in person. The meeting was emotional, but it was also a turning point. "I'm so sorry for what I put you through," she told Mia, her voice breaking. "You didn't deserve that, and I hope one day I can earn your forgiveness." Mia, ever kind-hearted, nodded. "I forgive you," she said softly. "But I hope you'll use what happened to help others." Mrs. Thompson promised she would, and over time, she began volunteering with Tasha's mentorship program, using her experience to guide and support the next generation. The story of Mia and her fight for fairness didn't just stay within the community, it spread. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, people across the country were talking about the importance of inclusive policies in schools. Marcus was invited to speak at conferences, sharing his journey and encouraging other parents to stand up for their children. "Change starts with one voice," he would say. "But it grows when we come together." As the school year came to a close, Mia stood on stage at the 5th grade graduation ceremony, her heart full. She had been chosen to give a speech, and as she looked out at the crowd, she felt a surge of gratitude. "This year taught me that it's okay to be different," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And it's okay to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. I hope we can all remember that as we move on to middle school and beyond. Let's keep being ourselves, and let's keep making the world a better place." The audience erupted into applause, and as Mia stepped down from the stage, she was met with hugs from her family and friends. Marcus pulled her into a tight embrace, his eyes shining with pride. "You did it, kiddo," he said. "I'm so proud of you." Mia smiled. Feeling a sense of accomplishment she knew she'd carry with her for the rest of her life. The story of Mia and her fight for fairness had come to an end, but its impact would be felt for years to come. It was a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of adversity, and that one person's courage can inspire a movement. As the community moved forward, they did so with a renewed sense of hope and a commitment to creating a world where every child felt valued and respected. And for Mia, it was just the beginning of a lifetime of standing up for what's right.